our last Second Tuesday talk of 2021. That's the year, right?
Yes.
It's been a heck of a year. Okay, and we are finishing up the year with Desiree Bridge doing a presentation on Christmas and especially the Victorian era. And so it's a nice way to get into the holiday mood. So let me just tell you a little bit about Desiree. She is an historian with a passionate interest in the medical, culinary, and gardening knowledge from America's and England's past. She has a degree in history from UNC Greensboro and a degree in baking and pastry from Johnson & Wales, Charlotte. After 16 years of study, she is always happy to learn new information, experiment in her garden, and try out traditional recipes in her kitchen or fire pit.
Yes.
So we're fortunate today to have Desi here. Desi is also a board member of the Historical Society and is a wealth of knowledge, and she's always fascinating to listen to. I just am always open mouth the whole time she's talking. So take it away, Desi.
All right. Thank you all for joining me here today. We are going to be talking about a Victorian Christmas, and keep in mind, we tend to sometimes say the Victorians created everything, Christmas, and there are some things that they revived and made popular, and there are some Christmas traditions that are invented during the Victorian era. Now, the Victorian era goes from 1837 to the death of Queen Victoria, 1901. So it is named after Britain's queen. Her husband, Albert, Prince Albert, is German. And so a lot of the traditions I'll be talking about, you're going to see a trend. I'm going to say German immigrants, German descent coming out of Germany. And that's because he brought a lot of these holiday traditions with him to court. She welcomed them, and then it was kind of publicized across the country and over in America how the royal family celebrated Christmas. And so a lot of these revived trends or new trends became very popular, and for that time period, very trendy. I will once in a while go back into the foggy origins of some traditions, but we're not going to linger there too long. And I will be hesitant to say an exact date on certain things because it could be there's no written record, so we're really not sure the origins of maybe certain traditions that we know and love today. You'll often hear people talk about the fact that Christmas has pagan roots, and that's not to say that there aren't some traditions that were very popular around the winter festival. Midwinter, December 21st is coming up, the first day of what we consider winter for the season. Some of those did transition into the Christian era. Again, I'm not really going to go into that realm and that argument about which is Christian, which is pagan, and such like that. We're really going to be focusing mainly on the Victorian era. Now, one of the people that we tend to think about a lot this time of the year, especially small children, is St. Nicholas or Santa Claus. And he does have origins way back at the beginning of Christianity. He actually came about in 270 AD. He lived until about 343 AD. And St. Nicholas came from Turkey. He is a patron saint of many different careers and people, but one thing to note is he is a patron saint of children. And he was supposed to be known for being a secret gift giver to small children, especially those that perhaps couldn't afford or their family couldn't afford to have any form of a celebration. Let's just say back then's version of a working class. We're going to go back from that time period into the Victorian era. Throughout history, you're going to see various forms of a St. Nicholas in Europe, in England, and then, of course, with the immigrants coming over to America. The jolly St. Nick that we think about, though, really isn't going to come about until about 1823 with the poem The Night Before Christmas. That's really going to kind of form that idea of Santa Claus going from perhaps a more benevolent but sterner looking gentleman to a very jolly, happy, think of the Coca-Cola ads, Santa Claus that we think of today. Perhaps in a talk we'll do in the future, I may go back a little further and do a talk on Santa Claus in his evolution, because he had some interesting sidekicks throughout history. But for most of the part, by this time period, the Victorian era, especially in America, and especially by the time The Night Before Christmas poem comes out, people are really thinking of Santa Claus as a benevolent Christmas spirit, jolly gentleman who is going to reward you if you had been good throughout the Christmas season. Now, your rewards in the Victorian era might be a little different than our rewards today. Presents historically were oftentimes food items, especially things you couldn't get year round or you couldn't afford, such as your citrus fruit. Ever wonder why today you might still get an orange or any type of citrus near on your Christmas tree, maybe in your stocking? The origins are for the fact that it was a winter harvest fruit. And so this was a really great treat to get at Christmas time. Not only was it healthy for you, but it was something you were going to look forward to getting this time of the year. Another treat that has a very old history is your candy-coated almonds. We tend to call these Jordan almonds today. Most people, when I mention these almonds, just kind of go, they think of them as maybe a party favor at a wedding, something they've gotten that's a little stale. You almost crack your tooth trying to get into them. But candy-coated almonds go way back in history. And again, sweets, sugar, you're not eating it quite on the level we do today. So being able to get this sweet treat around the holidays would have been quite a pleasant surprise. The candy cane has a very old history too. Now, the red stripe is very modern. I'm not even going to wade into the debate of where the little hook came from, but candy canes or peppermint flavored sticks are an early candy that we also see very popular during the winter time. You're going to be making some little jellies, such as the cherry or little green jellies that I have here today. And you may even, as we progress into the 1800s, see decorative cookies being presented to you as a Christmas present. And these are Springerly cookies. We'll talk about these a little later on. But you could also see gingerbread cookies being hanging from your tree or being given to small children. Christmas did not start around Thanksgiving like it does today. For most families, Christmas really wasn't going to start until Christmas Eve. And one thing that we all that celebrate Christmas want to have, regardless of its size in our home, is a Christmas tree. And Christmas trees actually go way back into history until around we're going to say around the 1500s. Now, a Christmas tree could be something as simple as, it looks almost like a tiered pyramid with shelves. And you would set that up. And then when the family came in, candles could be lit on it. The oranges, the candies, the nuts would have been placed on it. Maybe some scripture would have been written out, and that would have been your Christmas presents. You could see at certain parts of history, the top of a tree being cut off and brought in. You can even see, and some folks that are from Pennsylvania will often mention that they've known of family members, older family members that have done this. They'll take a branch and then they'll cover it with cotton batting. And this could be a small little tabletop piece or something much larger, and then hang treats off of that as a form of a Christmas tree, especially if you live somewhere where you weren't able to harvest the top of a tree, or perhaps if you were poor and it was just easier to take some branches and decorate them that way. If you're noticing, I'm saying hanging the presents on the tree, that's because traditionally your presents weren't going to be wrapped and put underneath it like we're used to today. Again, these are going to be small little tokens that are given. They're oftentimes handmade, and you're going to hang them off the trees. The little ones are going to come in and be very excited about it. A toy that you could make at home for your children is something called a tomatrope. You're going to have a drawing on it, and you're going to have string, and then when you start turning it, do I have it upside down? Kind of. You're going to have, it looks like the little fishies are in a bowl. I also have one with a rabbit on one side, cage on the other. Sorry, I'm caging the bunny. And again, you flip it back and forth, and it looks like the creature has moved inside of the little cage. Any of you ever seen the Tim Burton movie Sleepy Hollow with Johnny Depp? There's a scene in it with him and the actress Christina Ricci where he's got a cardinal and he's twisting it back and forth. So they seem very simple, but these were very, very popular toys, and they're very light, and you can hang them from the tree. With your candies, you might see them actually taking beautiful paper like marbleized paper or some form of decorative paper that they would either produce themselves or purchase from a bookbinder, and they could roll that into a cone and then hang that on the tree with the candy sticking down into it. Now, underneath the tree, if you don't have presents, what you can see early on is maybe a little townscape. From some of your Germans, they're going to call it a Putz. Sometimes it could be a town, sometimes it could be a nativity. We tend to, and you can see I've got this behind me, we tend to do little tiny Dickens villages and such like that in our homes today. And we tend to think a lot of times this has its origins in the 1950s, but these decorative little villages go way back. And it was, again, just another fun thing to set up for your family for when they come in. Because one thing the Victorians are good at is they're good at finally including their children into the Christmas season. You go back in history, let's see, even medieval times, which really, their 12 days of Christmas were amazing. But it's really adult oriented. It's you would travel somewhere, let's say you're wealthy to court, you're going to celebrate the 12 days of Christmas. You're not really thinking about keeping your children by your side or traveling and spending that time with your family. It is the Victorian era where we start seeing families kind of coming together. And one place you can look at that is what's considered the first Christmas card, which was produced in 1843. Henry Cole actually had an artist, and it's J.C. Horsley, make him up a copy, about 1,000 copies. Well, he designed it, and then they took it to a printer and got 1,000 copies of this Christmas card. In the center, you see a family partaking of a little bit of wine. And on either side of the panels, you saw them basically giving alms or helping the poor. But it was interesting to note that in this card, you are seeing the adults and children celebrating at the same time. Now, this Christmas card, one, people really like the idea of. He was falling behind on responding to letters, and that was considered ill-mannered during that time period, which is why he decided to go the next stage and have all these cards produced. He also had printed on it too, so he could just sign in the name and go quickly and send out his Christmas cards. But the Victorian era is also, to an extent, the era of the temperance movement. So some folks did have issues with this Christmas card he sent out because the children are drinking small glasses of wine. Keep in mind, prior to the temperance movement, a lot of people of all ages are drinking alcohol. You're not really relying on your water like we do today. But some folks really liked his Christmas card idea. Others said, you know, it's lovely, but let's, next time it's produced, not have the small children drinking their wine in it. In America, our first Christmas card is believed to come about in 1875 by a Prussian immigrant Prussia is at this time period part of Germany. His Christmas card was just a beautiful floral card, and it said Merry Christmas on it. And in fact, some of your earlier ones are typically going to be more of a floral motif. And as we progress into the 1800s, into the 1900s, you're going to see more and more of the Christmas cards that we think of today. Now, why is it the Victorian era? A lot of people were like, is it because, you know, printing is becoming more of an accessible thing? Is paper coming down in prices? It's actually your stamps that are making Christmas cards something you can do during this time period. The penny black stamp came out in 1840 in England. And the reason that's important is because it was a prepaid stamp. So you could just stamp your letter and send it off. Whereas before, when you sent out mail, you were going to have to pay for it once it was received. In America, we see ours come about in 1847. The 5-cent stamp had Benjamin Franklin on it. The 10-cent stamp had George Washington on it. And they were also self-adhesive. So that was nice too. You could just stick it on and then mail out your card. So that's really why we see kind of decorative cards taking off in this time period, is you can actually afford now to send them out in mass compared to before, where you might send a card to someone and they may be like, I really don't want to pay for this, but okay, thank you. Now, back to the Christmas tree real quick. I get a question I get from a lot of folks is, we see illustrations of the Christmas tree having candles on it. Did this not cause mass fires? Were houses burning down all the time? We tend to forget that back then you were very much aware of fire being dangerous. You're always going to keep an eye on it. It's kind of like today, we do not leave our stove on, hopefully, with a kitchen towel laying across it. Hopefully, I know it happens sometimes, but again, the tree would have been decorated on Christmas Eve. Well, the candles would have been lit before you open the door and let your family come in, or whenever you were doing that celebration. And often you would trim back branches so that you're putting the candles out on the edges and you're keeping an eye on it. Plus, candles are still relatively expensive during this time period. So you're going to kind of let everyone have the wow factor. And then most folks are then going to quickly blow those candles out and then store them somewhere so that they'll have them throughout the winter months. Edison Electric Light Company does come out with Christmas lights around 1882, but they are very, very expensive. So it's really not going to be until the 1900s, around 1930s, that you're going to see folks putting electric lights on their Christmas trees. Ornaments are going to start coming about in the 1890s. They're going to be simple lead ornaments or glass ornaments. They were commercially produced out of Germany. And then later on, you will see companies in America, Eastern Europe, and even Japan starting to mass produce Christmas ornaments. And with your commercialization of a lot of Christmas products, you're going to start to see homemade products fall by the wayside for those that could afford to purchase pre-made. And one thing that's really going to become popular is nutcrackers. Around 1872, you see nutcrackers being commercially produced. Now, this is going to then be followed in 1892, the Nutcracker Ballet. And the Nutcracker is basically going to quickly work its way into Christmas traditions. Now, some people might like to keep their nutcrackers out year-round. Others, such as myself, we tend to store them away, dust them off this time of the year, and then bring them back out. Now, mine is solely decorative. I can move his mouth, but I don't think he can crack a nut. A lot of your earlier ones could crack a nut. And again, mentioned earlier, nuts would have been a popular treat this time of the year. So getting a nutcracker and then a bag of nuts would have been a treat a lot of people would have welcomed during this time period. So we have covered a lot of different aspects of Christmas already. So we've seen the Christmas tree working its way into the home. We're seeing objects starting to be mass produced. As far as presents you're making for your family, again, as we go into the 1800s, into the early 1900s, and Victoria passed in 1901, so we're really going to say the 1890s. You're going to see more and more people starting to Christmas shop and go out and buy presents. Early wrappings could have been nice cloth you had around the home, maybe decorative paper, again, like that paste paper or marbleized paper that you had on hand. Wrapping paper that we see of today is going to be a little later on. It could even be something as simple as just tying a bow around it. You weren't expecting to get as many presents as some of us expect to get today. So typically each person would have gotten one gift. Now, the royal household, they have more money, but we even see sometimes with the royal household, it's a very expensive gift, but they are getting a gift. And this is not a Victorian tradition. Gift giving goes way back. We do see it in medieval times. In fact, during Henry VIII's court, one day of the 12 days of Christmas was a gift-giving day to King Henry. So if you wanted to stay on his good side, you were going to make sure you gave him something that he really wanted that Christmas. By the time we get to the Victorians, you do see gift giving occurring, but typically it was around New Year's Day. So again, that interesting illustration of Queen Victoria and her husband with their children around the Christmas tree and presents there, people start saying, oh, well, let me give my presents at this time of the day. If the royal, or time of the year, if the royal family is celebrating Christmas, that sounds like something I kind of want to replicate in my home. Do we have any questions so far? I know I'm covering a lot during this.
So,
yes.
I have a question. Well, it's not a question, actually. It is you mentioned Pennsylvania and
Yes.
things going to stockings, and you forgot something.
Oh, no, what?
If you're a bad little boy, you got coal in your stocking.
Yes. Coal is, coal does start becoming more and more popular, or it becomes a more popular household item as we go into the 1800s. It's going to replace your firewood basically in your chimney. So you would have coal as a standby. And what you're going to see is historically, if you were a bad child, Santa Claus may have had a sidekick that was not a very nice person. Most people will think of Krampus as one of them. So it's almost a demon-like creature that's with Santa Claus, and he might switch you on the back, chase you around the room, basically scare you. Coal is kind of replacing that. So we're getting to the point where it's, if you don't behave yourself, you're not going to get a present, but your siblings are. You're going to get this piece of coal in your stocking or as a gift. And that is a much gentler way, I think, of making kids behave themselves over certain time periods where it was, pardon the French, you'd be dragged to hell if you don't behave yourself, kind of a parent metaphor. Now, German immigrants, we have to thank them for a lot of these traditions coming to America. We're not going to see certain areas of America embracing these Christmas traditions, though, and that's going to be your groups that have their Puritan roots. They saw way too many pagan associations with early Christmas traditions. Even the greenery brought into the home, they saw that as a pagan root, which bringing greenery into your home goes way back into history. Some have even suggested it solely has to do with those that suffer from seasonal depression. They look outside, it's dark, it's gloomy. Bringing in evergreens and holly berries and just getting something alive in your home would have probably lifted the mood for some folks. It does have also some Christian origins in the fact that especially your holly, which in America, we have the American holly would have been used. The leaves have little points on it. So they would say it represents like the crown of thorns that would have been put on Jesus's head. You would see the red representing the blood. You could see green representing everlasting life. Mistletoe, you do see coming into practice. I'm not exactly sure on when the kissing with mistletoe comes about, but it is considered it has an interesting history, we'll say that. I'm not going to go into Norse mythology, but it does have by this time period a belief that it can be a romantic plant. So that might be where you see it coming from. But prior to mistletoe in America, you could see kissing balls, which would have been a round ball of evergreen hanging that you might just use as display for decoration. It could be something you would sneak a kiss of someone you were interested in underneath. But your German immigrants are they're going to win out when they come over here. And again, what's really going to help is during the 1800s, we do see a lot of American heiresses, especially from up north, marrying into British families, noble families. They're going to see the trends going on, and they're going to either relate it back to their family in letters or maybe have their family come over and witness these traditions. Baking during the holidays was a little trickier than it is today. If you go back far enough in history, especially during Advent, you're supposed to be fasting during the Christmas season. So butter wasn't going to be used in your baking. You would use oil. Throughout history, oil isn't often a cheap ingredient. In fact, in the area of Germany, we see people complaining because they had to use turnip oil, which I've never used, so I can't tell you how it works, to make stollen. That's that bread that has studded dried fruit throughout it. Think of it as almost like a biscotti, but in bread form. You actually want them to kind of dry out. So you would slice it and then dip it in your hot beverage to eat. By about, I'm going to say I think it's 1400s, we see some people complaining about the fact of butter not being used. The Pope relents, and you do see those of the elite allowed to put butter in their stooling in that part of the world, but really it's not going to be until the Protestant faith comes about and spreads that you're going to see fasting kind of fall by the wayside during Advent and people using butter throughout the holiday season for their baking. If you've never had stooling, I highly recommend it, especially if you can get your hands on a company that's known for their stooling, or you find a recipe. If you like marzipan, which is an almond paste, sometimes it's down the center of it. If you don't like marzipan, you can get stoolings with just almond slivers in it. It's folded a certain way and it's covered with powdered sugar. It's supposed to actually represent the baby Jesus sleeping with a blanket over top. Some people don't particularly like that idea. Others think it's very sweet. But again, if you get a chance, I do recommend trying stooling. As far as what you would be using in place of baking powder and baking soda, because keep in mind, those are modern chemical leavening agents we use, you could be using pearl ash, which you would have seen quite plentiful in this country. Pearl ash is actually a byproduct of the ash from your hearth. And you can also see them using hartshorn, or what we call baker's ammonia today. And hartshorn is the inner part of a red deer's antler. And in fact, those cookies that I mentioned earlier, the Springerly cookies, today you can use baking powder, you can use baker's ammonia, or if you can get your hands on it, you can use the hartshorn. And what it's going to do is it's going to actually brighten the dough. It's going to give it a crisper crust. So these cookies that you would have been making and eating are going to be more along the line of kind of like those really puffy animal crackers that you get in the plastic tubs at the grocery store. It's not going to be a soft cookie like we're used to today. Earlier recipes do call for sugar. You go back further, honey could be used in place, or you can even see these cookies being made without sugar and just being eaten as a hard biscuit. Now, Springerly's have an ancient history. You will see people during the Middle Ages going on pilgrimages. And oftentimes when you went to the site you were basically going on pilgrimage to, you could buy a medal, often a little metal piece to take back to prove you had gone. If you could not afford that, they believe they would have made little stamped biscuits, basically like a Springerly cookie, that you would then wrap up and you could take back to prove that you had finished your pilgrimage. Springerly's look like very elaborate, difficult cookies to make, and they're not. If you have a modern mixer, they're really easy. If you don't have a modern mixer, you would have been using a whisk with a bunch of little twigs that are clean tied together, and you're going to froth that egg mixture and then add in the rest of your ingredients. It's a relatively stiff dough. It almost feels like Play-Doh. And then to imprint the design, you can see them using a carved rolling pin, or you can see them using a carved little block stamp that they would press down into the dough and then cut out to bake. But you can also see these cookies being let to air dry, and then they would paint them and you could use them as a decoration. If you still wanted to eat them, they would use what we would consider food coloring or food safe dyes. If you did not care about eating these cookies, you wanted to keep them as a decoration, then you were going to use whatever paint that you could get your hands on to decorate them. We think of not just cookies and cakes being served, but for most Americans, if you ask them what meat they're having for Christmas, they might say ham or turkey. Now, turkeys weren't all that popular for a couple reasons historically, not so much in America, but over in Europe. One, they were hard to come by. They were very expensive. And even your goose is going to be a bit temperamental to cook up properly. And that's because they're just such a big bird. You want to make sure as you're roasting it, you're cooking it all the way through. Now, the railroads, once they're established in England and in America, you're going to start seeing food items that were hard to come by suddenly become plentiful, and you're going to see the prices come down. And turkey is one of those meats that are going to become more popular. And, you know, we can't just thank Victoria and Albert for a lot of the traditions that we have today. We also have to thank Charles Dickens and his Christmas Carol that he wrote. Now, he wrote it during this time period because he had another child on the way and he needed to make some money. So he quickly created a ghost story that embodied the Christmas spirit. And one of the things they mention is the Christmas turkey. And people read that. It was a very, very, very popular book, and went, I too want to have a Charles Dickens Christmas. I too want to have a roasted turkey. And so you just see a couple things align themselves perfectly for the turkey to kind of become what will be considered the perfect meat dish to have for your holiday feasting. Now, I think everybody knows Charles Dickens did not have a good childhood. So he almost overindulged during the holiday seasons. We see folks nicely sometimes, complaining about his parties, the food being a little too plentiful, a little too sweet, and a little too rich. But again, if you weren't able to have these things in your youth and you can afford to have them as an adult, and he wanted to make sure his children were having basically the experiences he wasn't able to have as a child, I can't blame him for going all out at Christmas time. Another thing that most people aren't aware of is, along with him needing to support his family and why he wrote The Christmas Carol, he had also finished recently touring the North Country of England. And up there, he had seen charity schools that were established for children of the very poor classes. And it made him sad to see these children that really should not be wanting, should not be in the circumstances that they were in, that he had been in. So hence the Christmas Carol having a very good moral to it throughout, which is someone with money realizing that they could do good to their fellow men and at the end giving back. So he was also kind of hoping that he was touching a chord with people that could be more beneficial around the holiday season. And remember that not everyone was going to have off for Christmas. In fact, you were lucky throughout its season, if you were of the working or poor class, to even have one day off for the holiday season. They were much, much harsher times than we're used to today. So we've got turkey, we've got some baked treats at our table. I mentioned earlier the temperance movement was going on. So you may see some beverages being produced and drank, such as a punch we'll be talking about in just a little bit. But you can also see fruit juices being drank during this time period, eggnog being prepared without maybe whiskey or rum or brandy added into it. One beverage that was quite popular, and I actually make every year and it's really, really good, is syllabub. And syllabub is where you would take a wine and then you're going to mix it with heavy whipping cream until you've got this nice froth, it's soft peaks. You then pour it into a glass, and what you could see them doing, and you see this recipe all the way back in colonial America, is maybe setting it somewhere cool, like down in your cellar. And what you want to happen is you want it to separate. So on top, you'll get this light, delicately flavored wine whipped cream. And you can see some recipes with sugar and even citrus added to it. So it might have a sweet lemony flavor. And then the bottom is going to be your slightly different flavored wine, because again, you might be adding spices, sugar, or citrus to it. They would pretty much use whatever wine was available. So you could see recipes where it's a white wine, a red wine, and I've even seen recipes where they'll mix the red and the white. So you get this beautiful kind of like a rosé or a blush color between the two of them. And this was considered a treat, not just for adults, but also for children. Again, you're consuming a little more alcohol historically than we are today. Now, with that, I think we're going to go on to the slides, and I'm going to show you some of the recipes that we've got, and hopefully, yes, I've got time. Then we can do questions for those that might have some. All right. So we have here a lovely illustration of a family celebrating Christmas. And you can see we've got a mix of ornaments hanging from the tree and also presents hanging from the tree and some gifts underneath it. And even some, it looks like by that little girl's hand, a little bundle tied up for the Christmas time. All right, next slide. All right, smoking bishop. So this was supposedly one of Dickens' favorite punches to have. So you are going to want to preheat your oven to 350 degrees Fahrenheit, and you're going to take some oranges and cloves, or excuse me, oranges, such as whichever ones you can get your hands on, slice them in half, And then you're going to stud it with cloves, kind of like you would if you're putting this into a bowl to basically kind of use as a natural potpourri in your home, or think of if you're simmering it in a pot of water, again, for scent like we tend to today. You could use a bitter citrus, but really this recipe will work with whatever type of orange you would like to use. If you want it to be a little more bitter, and let's say you're doing nothing but navel oranges, just get a lemon or two to add into the mix. You're going to place them on a parchment lined sheet pan, and the parchment's there to make cleaning a lot easier later on, but also you don't want any of that metallic flavor to kind of work its way into the citrus fruit. And you're just going to roast them until basically the inner part is just starting to kind of burst out a little bit. It depends on your oven and how hot it is, whether it's going to be 35 to 45 minutes. If you have the option of doing convection on your oven, I would go ahead and do convection. That way you're getting a nice even heat throughout. Once you've roasted them, you're going to put them in a glass container. Think of like a very large mason jar, something that you know is not going to react to the acid in the citrus. Also, something that might handle heat. You can then add brown sugar to your preferred taste. You can add whole cinnamon sticks, star anise. Now, anise or anise, however you want to pronounce it, that's a spice that some people love or hate. It does have a bit of a licorice flavor to it. If you do not like star anise, then get some cardamom pods and put those in instead. It's going to do a good flavor blend. You're going to pour 1 bottle of red wine in and then let it sit in a sunny spot for 24 hours. Do make sure that the pot, the glass, whatever you're putting it in, the clear glass, I should say, is clean and the lid is clean, and you're not going to have any problems. You're also not going to keep this there for weeks for fermenting. You're going to strain out your solids and then pour the liquid into a sauce pot. And then you're going to bring it back into a simmer. You can add port to it at this point. Now, I've had some people tell me they're not fans of port. So for a modern adaptation, go ahead and add maybe whiskey, brandy, rum. I would recommend brandy. And then you're going to remove any whole spices that might be left in it. Let's say you tried it and you thought there needed to be some more cinnamon. Feel free to plop them in at this stage for the simmer. But mainly you're to serve this hot. Not so hot you're burning your mouth, but it's supposed to have the steam coming off of it, hence the smoking bishop's punch. If you ever want to fall down a rabbit hole of recipes, just Google smoking bishop's punch and variations, and you're going to see that during this time period, there were tons and tons of recipes for all types of fun cocktails that are becoming trendy again today, and you're seeing at a lot of your pubs and bars and restaurants where, especially the holiday season, they want to bring them back in. All right, next slide. So this is the recipe for the Springerly cookies that I talked about. Now, this recipe, I will say, comes from a really, really, really good website. It is called, and it's down on the bottom, houseonthehill.net. They are an excellent source for all things Springerly and other types of traditional cookies. I don't know if they still have it, but at one point they even had a tutorial going through each stages. So if you're like, I don't feel too comfortable mixing these, I'm not sure exactly what they want me to see, check out their website. We used it at Old Salem whenever we had to reproduce the Springerly cookies around the holiday season, just as a refresher to be like, all right, how are we going to do this? Of course, at Old Salem, we weren't using a mixer, we're using the whisk and doing it by hand. The cookies that you're seeing there are ones that I made up for a staff party. They haven't been baked yet, but they have sat out overnight. And that's the important thing, is you need to let these cookies sit out to dry. You're going to see your pattern come into relief. And that way, when you actually bake the cookie, it's not going to spread out and melt on you. It's okay for the dough to be a little stiffer in this recipe than what you would typically work with. You're using cake flour, which has very, 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 very little gluten in it, very little protein in it. It is not like your AP flour, which is usually a mix of cake and bread flour. And it's certainly not like your bread flour, where as you keep working the dough, it's going to be stiffer and stiffer. Once you've rolled it out, just kind of press your rolling pin or whatever you're imprinting the design into the dough with. If it forms a nice pattern, you know you've pretty much have reached the consistency. If you do that and it's sticking, it's not doing a good job, then just go ahead and add a little more flour into it. But this last batch that I've made, the cake flour was very thirsty. So I ended up adding quite a bit of flour to it. And I didn't just, once I get it on the table, I switch over to AP flour. So don't feel like you have to keep using cake flour throughout. I use Swan's Down. If you can get your hands on organic, unprocessed, unbleached cake flour, go ahead. Just keep in mind, regardless if it's cake, AP, which is all purpose, or bread flour, think of flour as something alive. It's going to be different every time you work with it. And even if you know what is chemically going on, you may have to make some adjustments by adding a little more liquid or a little more flour. So if you stiffen this dough to the point where it's like a rock, just let it first rest and then maybe incorporate by dipping your fingers in cold water. Work that into the dough to see if you can loosen it up a bit. But again, this is a recipe I love because it was tested in a test kitchen and it's good to go. And I've known many beginners that have used it. And as long as you follow the instructions through, you'll be able to get some pretty nice looking cookies when you're done. Now, the flavoring, it's up to you. Historically, Springerly's might have been flavored with, again, anise or anise. In France, you might see lavender. Other parts of Europe, you might see citrus. I tended to do orange zest. I'll do like 2 oranges to this recipe, zest it. And then I like to do a colonial blend of spices, and that's usually cinnamon, cardamom, a little bit of allspice, clove, and nutmeg. It's kind of an adaptation of something that I've seen written before, which is kind of like their seasoned spicing that they would put on meats and savory and sweet dishes and such like that. It just seems to be a good blend, and I don't ever measure it out. I just kind of go by smell. All right, next slide. So here is the rolling pins and then the block print that I was talking about. And you can find these online. A lot of folks are starting to get back into more traditional crafts. A good source for finding rolling pins would be Etsy. There's quite a few American small companies that are getting back into it, and they're producing Springerly molds along with rolling pins. The other thing you could do is you can get like a Wilton candy mold or chocolate mold, and you can press that down in. Because they're typically silicone, they have a less chance of sticking. For your rolling pins and block prints, have a pastry brush nearby or a bowl of flour, and just make sure there's enough flour in it that when you print them, you're not worried about those little tiny spaces, cookie dough sticking in it and basically ruining the pattern. Next slide. All right, York gingerbread. So gingerbread, ginger in general is a popular ingredient historically around this time of the year. And it is my belief one of the reasons you see it popping up again and again is because it is known to settle the stomach. And if you can afford, you are overindulging a little during this time period. And so you might have a bit of an upset stomach. So eating something with ginger is going to help settle your stomach. But also we see ginger cakes, gingerbread in America pretty early on as a popular treat, not just up north, but also down here in the South. This is an old recipe. So it looks way weirder than what we would think of today. For instance, it's 6 teacups of sugar. Keep in mind, historically, you're not measuring like we do today. You're not using cups and teaspoons and tablespoons. Recipes can be very poetic in how they're listing their ingredients. Most teacups are going to be around the same size though. So for this recipe, you're going to want to think in cup form. So, and you can cut this recipe in half, by the way. This is a pretty large recipe. So you could do 3 cups of sugar, 3 cups, or excuse me, then you can knock that down on the butter, the molasses, the milk, 9 pounds of flour, knock that in half. Ginger, the 6 eggs, 2 teaspoons of pearl ash. Now, they're not talking about teaspoons and tablespoons like we do today. That's going to be a little different. Also, your pearl ash isn't going to quite have the oomph that your baking soda has today. So I've got also 1 cup of orange peel and spices, bacon a loaf. If anyone is interested in a modern translation of this York gingerbread, feel free to get in touch with us and I can send that out. But that said, if you go onto a lot of websites today and type in gingerbread, there's not much of a difference. The only difference you'll see in this recipe is that they're calling for baking soda instead of pearl ash. And they have the measurements in cups, teaspoons, and tablespoons. If you have a scale at home, you might want to weigh it out, but most of the time you can use cups and teaspoons and tablespoons. Gingerbread, as far as a recipe going from colonial times on to now, really hasn't changed much, which is why I'm saying you can just easily go online and find a modern adaptation if you want. The difference is whether you want to use powdered ginger or fresh ginger. I leave that up to you. I've done both. I do feel like you get a little more of a heat if you grate fresh ginger into it. And let's say most recipes are going to call for about a 1/4 cup of ginger. So if you don't want to grate that much, you can do powdered ginger and then some grated fresh. As far as your flour, if you want this to be more tender, use all-purpose flour. If you want this to be more of a bread consistency, you can use bread flour, but most of the time I tend to use all-purpose flour. Eggs, they're going to be large eggs that you get at the grocery store. If you're using baking soda, nix the vinegar. You don't have to worry about that. Your orange peel and spice, if you don't feel like zesting that much of an orange, 1/2 cup, let's say, then just go ahead and use a really good orange extract. And I would recommend, if you're going to do the citrus extracts, definitely go for something organic. They tend to have less of a chemical, alcohol-y, weird aftertaste that you can get in your baked goods. The one interesting thing about pearl ash, and I will say this compared to baking soda or even, let's say, baking powder, both of those can always lend a very, very slight metallic taste to your baked goods. Now, we're raised with it, so we really don't think anything of it. But if you've ever eaten a baked good where they used a more traditional leavening agent, you actually don't, you're like, something's missing. You can't quite put your finger on it. It's that slight metallic flavor that we're all kind of used to that's not in the traditional items. All right, next question or slide. All right, roast suckling pig. I've never done this one before. So mainly because I only eat meat once it's reached a certain age. So I'm afraid I don't eat suckling pig. I am not a veal fan, and I don't eat lamb either. That said, I did know someone and his family did pit barbecuing, and they took a large hog and they stuffed it full of chestnuts and apples, and they sewed it up and they roasted that slow, just like you would have back in the past, just not over hearth. It was outside, and he brought in the meat for us to sample. And I can tell you, there is a reason why you always want apples and pork and nuts to go together. It's just a perfect pairing. If you want to try this at home and you don't want to go hunting down a butcher to get a suckling pig, what you can always do is take pork loin, slice it down, And then you're going to take your apple and chop it up. Think of making almost like you're going to be making a chutney. So chop up and cube your apple, mix into that maybe some nuts if you want. If you don't want nuts, you don't have to do that. Some butter will be good in there, maybe some onions. You can then either sew it back up or kind of roll it tight and force that seam down and then put it into your oven to roast. Basting it maybe with some apple juice would be really good. I've done that before, or you could even just use whatever broth you have on hand. Another thing that's pretty tasty, it's not the healthiest thing, but I do love doing this, is just have a pat of butter on the side that's room temp and soft, and slather that pork loin with the butter. And, you know, you can brush it a little bit on later on too. And that butter, and then especially again, if you do nuts, and they don't have to be chestnuts, it could be walnuts or almonds, whichever you prefer. I do recommend going with a nut with more of a tannin, a stronger flavor, and the apples and onions. It's really, really good, especially when you serve this with some type of potato. If you want to try making roast suckling pig the old-fashioned way, feel free. It was a popular treat throughout history. Go back far enough and it actually would have been a boar. And the areas you really wanted to eat was the snout, the cheeks, and the ears. If you ever get a chance, there's Tony Robinson. He is a historian over in England. He's also, if you've ever seen Blackadder, he was in those specials often as a sidekick. He is an amazing person, and he's done specials called Worst Jobs in History. I highly recommend, I think you can find it on YouTube. You look up his worst Christmas jobs in history. And one of the things he does is he prepares a boar's head for the Christmas supper. And it's going to make you so happy you live today. And we can just go to the grocery section, go to our meat section, pick up that meat that doesn't look anything like the creature we're eating, and go home and prepare it. It's a fascinating look at what would have been done historically to process your meats. All right, I'm afraid to say this. Do we have any more slides? I can't remember. We've got slides of desserts. So we've got our mixed fruit, apricots, plums, Christmas plum pudding, strawberries. Again, you're eating a lot of fruit, and especially if you're a Victorian who had a greenhouse and you're able to grow these items out of season, you would have been eating them this time of the year. Little jellied confections would have been popular. Even desserts that typically we know as Turkish delight would have been served during this time period. Next slide. And here we have a Victorian family enjoying their meal. We've got down toward closest to us, we've got some type of a punch. We've got our meat, all kinds of fun dishes set to that table. It looks like a big bowl of roasted potatoes too. I like the loaf of bread down by the teacups down there. Next slide. All right, and here is that illustration I was talking about earlier. We got Prince Albert and Queen Victoria with their children around their Christmas tree. So thank you all for joining us today. Does anyone have any questions for me? I know that was a lot to pack in there.
Desiree, that was excellent. Again, I just learned so much from you every time that you give a presentation. I really enjoyed it. So, and what was the name of the little toy you made with the piece of paper where you spun it? What's that called?
Homotrope.
I couldn't quite catch it with the video. What was it? Comatrope?
Helmotrope. So it's T. Mm-hmm.
With a T, Tomatrope.
Yes.
That was really cute.
Thank you. There would have been other little toys that they would have made, but my artistic abilities don't go much further. And yeah, that one I was like, I could do this, but it's kind of entertaining. You do one and then you're kind of like, oh, how many more can I do? And you just keep making them. And before TV, and not a lot of folks were able to get their hands on too many books, although that is becoming an easier and easier trend in the 1800s. I can see where it would have been very entertaining.
Does anybody have any other questions for Desi? There, I finally got the screen back. Anybody have any other questions for Desi? Oh, it looked like you had something. I had just a couple of things. What's pearl ash?
Pearl ash is what you would have used in place of a chemical leavening agent today. So it's basically a byproduct of the ash in your hearth. And it has, oh, I'm going to butcher this. My brain isn't functioning right now.
So like they would take ashes from their hearth and use that in their cooking?
They would, yes.
Wow. Okay. I had no idea.
It's it's on the tip of my tongue. The scientific chemical name for baking.
I don't know. You could tell me anything and I believe you though. But
yeah, it is legit. It was used. It is something that you would have had in a small tin in your home. As far as the hartshorn, you can see it, or baker's ammonia, as it's also known. Again, sugar is pretty expensive throughout history. And so you're not really consuming as many baked goods if we're talking about, let's say, the middle class on down as we do today. But that said, they still were making, with what they had during that time period, some pretty elaborate and interesting desserts. And the Victorians' palate is definitely different than ours today. You will still see quite a mix of sweet and savory. Think of mincemeat pies. People either love them or hate them today, and that is a mix of suet. So you've got meat, typically beef, and then you've got dried fruit being mixed together into a pie. Most Americans today, if they aren't familiar with that, you try feeding that to them and they're like, spices were used quite heavily, not only because they were believed to be good for you health-wise, but also they might be using them as a belief as a preservative. Perhaps the meat wasn't keeping as well as it should, so you're going to disguise some not so wonderful flavors. It's just, I can't imagine. It would have been such a different time period, and there's just, on the one hand, I think it would be magical to go back and see Victoria, America, or England during the holiday season, but I'm also very happy I live today with all of our modern conveniences and the fact that I can just string up some electric lights on my tree and I'm not, quickly lighting candles and keeping an eye on it.
Desi, I just want to make a note that in 1907, church cookbook from the St. Philip's Episcopal Church, that 11-year-old Lillian Dozier submitted her recipe for syllabub. 1 quart of cream, 1 goblet of sherry wine, sweetened to taste, and whipped till thick.
Yes.
Which little Dozier girl was that?
What's that?
What did you say? Who was it that submitted that?
The ingredients?
No, the little girl.
Lillian Dozier.
Lillian Dozier. Okay.
Oh, that is so cool.
Our friend Lou Hardy, who passed away about 2 years ago, he told me a story about Lillian Dozier, but Lillian Dozier was his aunt, and she was called Aunt Bitsy.
Oh.
Aunt Bitsy. And how did it go? She would say, "You can ask me my age, but you could never ask me my weight." And that was Aunt Bitsy.
That's a good one. That is a good one. Oh, potassium carbonate. That's what pearl ash is.
Okay.
Sorry.
All right.
I knew it was there.
Glad to know that. I'm glad we have a good brain break so that could pop up.
But no, the syllabub recipe, that's great because it's kind of like the York gingerbread. They're there's not much of a difference in the recipes as you see them. It's kind of like chocolate chip cookie recipes today. We all have something that we might do to tweak it, to call it our own, but it's such a good firm base of an original recipe. There's not going to be too many variations, but I do like that she was 11 years old and
Throwing in the sherry.
yeah, exactly. That's another reason why I love Southport, man. These people were having good times. They weren't like your Puritans up north.
A little bit, but okay.
Yeah,
So that is our last program of the year. Thank you very much, Desi, for finishing it up so strongly. And Bob, what are we doing in January?
What are we doing in January? Well,
Yeah.
we're having a Tuesday talk. I think that's the 11th of January, and Mike, the Southport storyteller, Mike Royal, and he's going to have a guest, and that's Ronnie Shannon, and they are going to be talking about all the shenanigans and all the things that happened, all the fun things that happened on Oak Island in their youth, so in the 60s and 70s. And I think that's going to be always a good, when Mike and his friends are together, it's always a good time. So I think folks will be interested in that.
And Oak Island was very different than it is now, so that'll be interesting.
Yeah. The other thing we have in January that comes to my mind is January 27th, which is the Southport Historical Society's annual meeting, and that will be at 6:30 on the 27th, and again we'll be doing that through Zoom.
Okay. All right. So you guys keep a lookout for that, and everybody have a wonderful holiday, and we'll see you in January. Thank you.
Thank you.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas,
everyone.
Merry Christmas. Bye.